Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this webinar and climate briefing organized by the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. My name is Marco Sidi and I am Senior Research Fellow in the European Union Research Program at FIA. Our topic today is Russia and climate politics, domestic developments and international challenges. Let me just say a few introductory words on the topic. Russia plays an important role in global climate politics. It is the fourth largest emitter of carbon dioxide, but also one of the largest carbon sinks, thanks to its vast forests. Let's just think of Siberian forests. And it also has a huge potential for the development of renewable energy. Climate change is increasingly visible in Russia, as highlighted by melting permafrost in the far north or the forest fires in Siberia. We saw particularly disastrous forest fires in the summer of 2019. Partly as a result of this, climate change is also a growing concern for substantial parts of civil society. Now, what has Russia done about this in international fora? It ratified the Paris Climate Agreement in September 2019. However, its current emission reduction targets remain unambitious. And this is partly due to its heavy dependence on the hydrocarbon economy. However, the expected decrease in the demand for fossil fuels globally will put pressure on Russia to adapt. This is particularly relevant to EU-Russia relations, with the EU being the largest market for Russia's fossil fuel exports. As the EU implements the Green Deal, Russia will progressively lose a key market for its exports of coal and oil first, and eventually gas. At the same time, there is also room for new types of cooperation, for more sustainable cooperation between the EU and Russia. Let's think about renewable energy development or hydrogen production. So these are some of the topics that we'll discuss today with our experts. I introduce them now in the order of their presentations. First of all, we will hear opening remarks from Dr. Jussi Lassila, who is Senior Research Fellow in the EU's Eastern Neighborhood and Russia Research Program at FIA. Jussi has published widely on issues related to Russian domestic politics, identity politics, nationalism, populism, and political communication. Today, he will briefly introduce a new FIA publication, a briefing paper that we co-authored and that you find also here in the chat. You find the link to it. The paper is titled Russia Meets Climate Change, the Domestic Politicization of Environmental Issues and External Pressure to Decarbonize. We'll then hear from Professor Anna Korpo, who is a research professor at the Fridtjof Nansen Institute, and she has been working on Russian climate change policies and politics at the national and international levels since 2000. Professor Korpo is the author of numerous peer-reviewed journal articles, book chapters, and policy briefs. Her latest co-authored book, published by Edward Elgar, is titled Informal Institutions in Policy Implementation, Comparing Low-Carbon Policies in China and Russia, and was published just a few months ago. We'll then hear a presentation from Dr. Igor Makarov, who is head of the School of World Economy of the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He has been a visiting scholar in several highly reputed universities, such as Stanford and Harvard University. Also, for FIA, Dr. Makarov has recently written a paper on Russia's perceptions of the European Green Deal, And you find the link to this paper also in the chat here. This is actually a pre-publication. The paper is part of a project that FIA has with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the German Development Institutes, focusing on global perceptions of the European Green Deal. And the series will start to be published in the next weeks. So Igor wrote the paper concerning Russia and Russian perceptions of the Green Deal. But a few remarks, organizational remarks. We will collect questions and comments in the chat. So you can write already during the presentations. We'll then collect them, or I will try to collect them, and we discuss them in the Q&A session after the presentations. Okay, let me now hand over the floor to my colleague, Jussi Lassila, for the first presentation. Jussi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marco, and hello to everyone. So I think that all of you who have any hint on the climate change as a topic in Russian public discussion have noted that it has played and plays much lesser role in Russia than in Western Europe. However, Russian public opinion seems concerned about environmental issues. According to Levada as well as state-aligned SIOM surveys, a clear majority of Russians believes that climate change is caused by human activities and has major negative effects for the country. The catastrophic Siberian forest fires of summer 2019 appear to have heightened these concerns. In fact, the attitude of Russians towards anthropogenic climate change is actually very similar to that the rest of Europe. The key difference is that perceptions of climate change as a major threat are not as widespread in Russia as in other European countries. However, just keeping in mind how climate change consciousness emerged in the West in the previous decade. It started from the local environmental concerns and problems towards different environmental movements and gradually also towards global framing of different local issues. And this might be also ahead in Russia in some perspective. Of course, it has been also become evident that some Russian narratives trade and portray and presumably will portray the idea of globally binding emission reductions as a kind of conspiracy of Western countries against Russia and its vital interests. Here, however, it is important to know that Russia does not have such domestic interest groups and political actors common in democracies whose pressure creates an essential framework for their international climate policies. For example, in the West, besides numerous pro-climate movements, there is also notable domestic resistance to states' climate policies by different right-wing populist groups. In this respect, the lack of any independent pressure groups means that the room for such a climate-skeptical populism in Russia, I think, is limited. Environmental issues have become politicized in recent years, especially with regard to the acute waste management problem in different Russian regions, just to mention, for example, the Moscow region and especially in Arkhangelsk, but also in many other places. Although ecological protests have occurred locally, they reflect wider dissatisfaction between the society and authorities. It can be assumed that the links to the global climate agenda may also emerge when highlighting a number of local environmental problems. In other words, political action to highlight climate change will develop if it contributes to focusing attention on environmental problems that Russian citizens experience directly. Meanwhile, the Kremlin's attitudes towards environmental organization has become more negative year by year, not least because it sees them as Western-backed actors opposed to its economic and political interests. In this respect, Russia's increasingly authoritarian development and deepening political conflict with the West may politicize and complicate cooperation in the fight against climate change. The case in point is the EU's Green Deal that includes a zero net emission target by the year 2050. This means that Russia would lose an important source of hydrocarbon export revenues, which are essential for the current regime. However, despite the Kremlin's tendency to interpret the EU's decarbonization policy as an additional hostile act against Russia's vital interests. The positive effect is that it may force the country towards real reforms, towards cleaner economy. Indeed, some Russian business and political actors have understood the need of transitioning to a greener society. Just take an example, Rusal, one of the world's largest aluminium producers, has already begun investing in climate neutral production, energy efficiency, and green technologies. And I think I will stop here and now move to our wonderful guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jussi, for these opening remarks. Let me now give the floor to Professor Korpo, who will introduce us to the topic of Russia and climate politics.
So, hello everyone, and thank you, Upi, for inviting me. Great to have this opportunity to speak about my favorite topic. So, I will talk about both domestic developments and external factors which influence Russia's climate policy. And here I'll take you quickly through some background issues before getting into these particular internal developments, and then some words about the external factors, which my colleague Igor Makarov will also cover in more detail later on. So quickly about the background. Many of you will be very familiar with this, but just in case there's somebody who's new to the topic, I should say that Russia is the world's fourth largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, with 2.4 gigatons, and you can see some details on the slide about the comparison with other countries. And also, an important issue is that Russia's greenhouse gas emissions collapsed after the Soviet Union. You can see this collapse here. If you can you see my mouse moving here? I'm showing.
We can't see the mouse, but we can see the slides very well.
All right, that's fine. So most industrialized countries would have a hill of emissions, and with climate policies, you would be coming downwards. Whereas in Russia's case, it's been the other direction because the economy was fairly inefficient, and it came down as the economic system changed and the economy reformed, and now it's been going upwards. Also, you see here on the right-hand side what has been happening to Russia's energy balance. So it hasn't been decarbonizing, not at all. But what has been happening is that the focus has been moving away from coal and oil towards gas, which is less carbon intensive. But still, the share of the sort of low carbon sources of energies is very low. I should also say that because of this collapse of emissions, Russia is going to achieve its Paris Agreement targets because it's taking into account the forest sinks, and therefore the target can only be considered as business as usual. So it's not ambitious at all. There you also see how the economy remains very carbon intensive. This you can examine by looking at the per capita emissions or the energy intensity of the economy. And the obvious issue is that Russia is very dependent on the fossil fuel economy because of its energy exports. That maybe also is linked to the long-running issue of climate skepticism in Russia. So let's get into the first internal issue, and that would be the Paris Agreement. It should be said in the beginning that international climate agreements indeed are spurring Russia to do something about climate, and or at least to talk about it. So they have an important role to play there. Russia adopted the Paris Agreement in 2019, and I'm emphasizing adopted because it was actually not ratified by the State Duma like one could have maybe expected it to be. And there has been perhaps some opposition to adopting or ratifying this agreement in the Duma, so the president adopted it instead. There was also a regulation which put forward the Russian target under the Paris Agreement. So that is the 25 to 30% decline of the 1990 level by 2030. At the moment, there's discussion about how should the Paris Agreement be implemented. And the first carbon tax or a domestic emissions trading scheme was proposed, but that was actually rejected by the Russian industry, saying that discussion on carbon regulation is premature in Russia, and partly because Russia is going to achieve its target without further implementation. At the moment, there's a pending proposal which would only include emission reporting and also voluntary carbon projects. And there's been further discussions related to the Paris Agreement. In the beginning, of course, before the agreement was adopted, there were the kind of traditional pros and cons discussions, whether this makes sense for Russia, and there were skeptical views about what is this an environmental agreement, or are there some economic interests on the background? But I would say that discussion has been somewhat more positive than, for instance, in the Kyoto days, which many of you who I've seen are here in the audience would remember. And of course, it's clear that the Paris Agreement was not adopted by President Putin for environmental concern. Maybe it doesn't even need to be said, but it's an easy target, is an easy way of showing participation and maybe collect some image points. An interesting issue around the Paris Agreement implementation has recently been the calculation of forest sinks. Here, this is a kind of a meeting of the Russian forest sinks discrimination discourse, if you like. There are many voices in Russia, I'd say, who see the Russian forests as very valuable and that they should be recognized much more than they have been recognized under the international climate agreements. And when that meets the misunderstanding whether also sort of natural carbon sinks should be calculated under the Paris Agreement, not only the anthropogenic, then you kind of have the soup cooked. So this is what's happening in Russia at the moment. So the methodology how forest carbon sinks are going to be calculated, that's under revision by the Ministry of Natural Resources. For instance, the Ministry of Economic Development has been voicing against this and saying that it wouldn't be likely to be adopted or accepted internationally. But anyway, this kind of process is now ongoing. And I've read just in the newspaper in Kommersant that one reason would be perhaps that therefore Russia could appear as a smaller emitter, not as a major emitter over time, if more carbon sinks were calculated for Russia's good and that they could offset more of Russia's emissions. So therefore Russia's kind of role as a major emitter would kind of vanish to some extent. Of course, there are independent experts who say that this is very difficult to make waterproof, this kind of new methodology. There are data uncertainties and so on, and the international approval will be, of course, a question. Also, there's been some discussion about the voluntary carbon projects, which are kind of similar to joint implementation projects, which we saw under the Kyoto Protocol. But there, at the moment, the demand for projects would have to be domestic. And of course, you would then need to have some kind of carbon regulation for domestic companies in order to generate demand for this kind of projects. Further on, you could maybe link to the EU, who knows, maybe there will be functional carbon market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement over time, but that's not the case yet. Then let's turn to the second internal issue, which is I'll just be listing the domestic policies and measures that came to my mind, and there will be some further policies, of course, which are relevant here. But of course, the field of energy efficiency, all the way from the federal law in 2009, and now there are also further programs on energy efficiency. They are relevant here. They have potential to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But the main interest here would be modernization of the economy, perhaps also the competitiveness of the industry. A lot of such policies, though, have not been focused directly on the industry, but very often to the public sector. So then there you can ask whether this is really being optimal. The best available technology policy, which has now been launched and is being implemented the first year, this year is related here, and that focuses on industry. So that's something to watch. It's very difficult to say yet if how much is going to come out of that in terms of emission reductions. Then there is a fairly small scheme of renewable energy tender, so that the state buys some renewable energy projects, and that seems to be functional, but it's fairly small. You would remember that the renewable energy, other than hydropower, was zero in the Russian energy balance, so we're not quite there yet, if you like. But here, the domestic high technology development is really the driver, and it's quite a lot defining this renewable energy scheme, to the extent that a lot of the technology used there has to be Russian. Then there's my old favorite, associated petroleum gas flaring limitations. That has to do with the oil industry. Oil industry, when they drill oil, then there's going to be a burst of methane, this associated petroleum gas. And there were limits set to that from 2012. Here, of course, they're trying to make use of this kind of previously wasted material. There are many chemical industry and energy uses for that. And the latest one is the municipal waste reform. That is a wider issue, and perhaps mostly taking control of the waste sector is caused many problems over time, and also for public well-being and health, but there will be climate impact. And then you saw the switch from the other fossil fuels toward gas, and that is one issue that should be remembered. And then quickly, the third internal issue on domestic strategies. One should remember that there are many actors here active when drafting such strategies. For instance, energy strategy until 2035 is by the Ministry of Energy, and there the climate issue appears mostly as some kind of threat to the Russian economy. For instance, the share of coal is seen to grow. There is an important role for coal, and so on. So it doesn't really coordinate with any kind of climate targets, if you like. There's also a national adaptation plan, which is ongoing work. And here it's not only about the measures to reduce vulnerability, but it's also about taking advantages of the opportunities that climate change is going to provide, perhaps. And adaptation is also adaptation to economic impacts by mitigation measures of others. So carbon protectionism, we get to that later on. And then I wanted to say a couple of words about the draft low carbon strategy until 2050. This is draft, it's pending. The next date apparently when it's going to be discussed is going to be in June. But I thought it would be interesting to think of this as by the Ministry of Economic Development, and this would, in its current form, it would call for domestic regulation on carbon, and also it would also look at some measures for industry. Now that's quite interesting. It would also suggest a 33% reduction of emissions by 2030 instead of the current 25 to 30. But yeah, many voices in Moscow say that as it is now, it's very unlikely to go through. In any case, I will show you a quick view of this strategy and of the emission projections it includes. There you see some peaking. It's in Russian, but I'll just use the colors here. So the blue one would be a basic scenario, and it still ends up higher after the peaking in 2050 than where we are now. So in a way, the green line, the lowest one, it would contain some real emission reduction policies. But this is far from progressive. But anyway, we do see peak and fall. That's interesting. This we don't have time for. If somebody is interested in the different scenarios, there were some details if Pia is going to share the presentation. Okay, let's then say a couple of words about the external factors, as I promised. And here the carbon pricing is of course linked to the EU carbon border adjustment plans. In Russia, it has for a long time been seen just as a plan or being kind of against the WTO rules. And as there are no fixed rules yet, so some actors in Russia see this as perhaps uncertain. And it's been called carbon protectionism throughout all these strategies and plans that I just went through. And even the foreign policy concept from 2016 is making the same point, that using environment to encourage something which is called unfair competition, it would not be accepted by Russia. More recently, though, there's been sort of more positive tone, which I call the new low carbon trend discourse. So many actors in Russia do see that the Russian industry just simply has to start getting prepared for the EU carbon payments on the border. That it doesn't help if we oppose to them, if they're going to be launched anyway. And there, the domestic carbon regulation, maybe a carbon price, would be a useful starting point for the company. But Igor is going to speak much more about this. And one can't really finish before mentioning what was already mentioned in the beginning, and that is the decline in demand for fossil fuels. That's certainly a major external impact driving policies that would reduce emissions in Russia. And we are only in the beginning. Here I'm giving a couple of examples about coal, because I've been looking at the Russian coal sector to some extent for the last months. And sure, EU phasing out coal and EU's net zero emissions by 2050. That's a major first impact here. Again, in Russia, there are a lot of talks about how there's internal opposition still in the EU. Some countries are not agreeing on this. And it won't be easy, for instance, for Germany in practice to get this done, to close coal mines, to get rid of coal, and so on. And it's been labeled as international campaign against coal. And surely it's understandable. It's kind of maybe seen as an attack towards one sector. New demand is expected and hoped for from Asia Pacific area, but of course there's also a low carbon trend there. It doesn't really mean that one can just move away from the EU for long term on another area. Also, the diversification of the coal sector has been discussed in terms of developing clean coal technologies, coal chemistry, higher quality of coal to get higher price by selling less, so on. And the coal sector has been organizing itself to coordinate exports more. And also further energy sector, so kind of diversification towards hydrogen economy, and more renewable energy has been under discussion, but those are discussions for now. And then I have a couple of concluding points at this point. So, of course, there'll be some serious updates or policies that have a carbon component in Russia, but Russia does remain a laggard on low carbon policy for now. Domestic policies are normally driven by some other interests than actual emission reduction, as I was going through with the policy examples. And domestic strategy is now being worked. That's a good thing. The thing is being discussed, it's being thought through, but it does lack ambition, as obvious. And very often, like in the forest issue, it is focusing on avoiding or opposing policy which would actually lead to emission reductions at home. Of course, it's costly. Environmental policy is. And therefore, the external drivers are very important for getting the Russian climate policy going in practice. And the economy has to be restructured because of the declining demand for fossil fuels internationally. And what I call the kind of discrimination attitude, that Russia is somehow being targeted and maybe discriminated by other policies of others, it's very much there. But the question is it going to be turning because of more practical and sort of understanding and well-informed views by many experts? Well, perhaps not yet, but I hope that one day it will. All right, I just show that before I finish. That was my current work, my current projects, and as I think Marco was mentioning, my book. So if somebody's interested, there is a discount code for that if you would like to perhaps buy it. So I'll leave that there. Also my contact details. Get in touch if you want to discuss this more. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for this excellent overview. There's some questions already in the chats, but before we move to those, I would like to first give the floor to Igor Makarov for his presentation.
Thank you, Marco, and thanks for invitation. I'm very glad to be here, virtually, unfortunately. I will concentrate on what Anna calls the external factors of Russian climate politics, and specifically on the European Green Deal as one of the drivers, actually, of Russian climate policy. So I will start with the overview of Russian climate policies, then we'll shift to the risks of the European Green Deal for Russia, and then we'll try to cover the opportunities the European Green Deal brings to Russia as well. The next slide, please. And the next one. So actually, Anna told already about the dynamics of emissions in Russia. The only thing I want to add is that, of course, the dynamics of emissions in Russia was determined not only the collapse of the Soviet Union and the transitional crisis, to the huge extent is true, but also we should understand that the Russian GDP, it came back to the pre-crisis level. It came back to the level of GDP of the Soviet Union by 2007. But emissions are still about a half lower than emissions in the Soviet Union, emissions in the 1990s. It is because some modernization of Russian economy also took place, some restructuring of the Russian economy took place. In 1999, 2008, each year the energy intensity and carbon intensity of Russian economy decreased by 5%. So GDP increased, but emissions did not rise at all. It was because of restructuring of the economy and the rise of service sector. It was because of the modernization of industries. It was because of the development of gas generation, but not coal generation. It was because of the development of nuclear generation and so on. So I don't want to say that it was some climate-related measures. So the reduction of emissions was not the objective of all these measures and all this restructuring. But however, Russian economy is very different from the economy in the 1990s, and it should be understood. It's not only because of the reduction of GDP in the 1990s. So it was the result of economic reforms. It was the result of a really serious effort to restructure the economy. The next slide. Anna also calls the major points of Russian climate legislation. Most of them were adopted for the last couple of years, or some of them will be adopted in the near future, as, for example, the long-term low-carbon strategy, which now exists in the form of drafts only. And the law on climate regulations, on carbon regulation scheme, it also will appear in Russia in the near future. It is now under consideration in the State Duma. And I agree with Anna that most of these legislation is quite passive. So it exists in paper, but however, the targets that are set in this legislation are quite passive. Most of them would be fulfilled without any additional efforts. So like the NDC, Russian NDC, -30 compared to the 1990, it would be fulfilled without any additional efforts from the Russian side. And the same targets, -30 compared to 1990, it exists in the presidential decree on the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which was passed, which was signed last year. So Russia also has some targets for renewables. They are also quite passive, and even in this form, these targets are not fulfilled yet. But however, the progress, it also takes place. For the last couple of years, at least, this regulation appeared, and it created some like infrastructure for further climate policies, which probably would be more active than today. The law on carbon regulation scheme, which is now under consideration in the State Duma, it suggests no carbon pricing, but it suggests the system of monitoring and disclosure of emissions, which is not sufficient but necessary, at least. And that's why it's very good that this law at least appeared and would be adopted in the near future, because without this law, without the system of monitoring and disclosure of emissions, the further progress would be impossible anyway. That's why this regulation is very passive, but it is necessary, and it should be recognized as a good step forward. Why Russian climate policy is so passive? Of course, there are many different explanations, and Anna told about that climate skepticism exists in Russia, and that for Russia climate change is not the priority. And it was also said today, and Jussi said that yes, the awareness of environmental problem is increasing in Russia, but climate change is not the priority even among the environmental problems. If you ask Russians about environmental problems, they will say that they are very worried about the environment. But climate change is just number 7 among all the environmental problems, not number 1 at all. First of all, the major reason why Russian climate policy is so passive is, of course, fossil fuel dependence of the economy. And the next slide. And it is objective. It should be understood that Russia is, if we compare Russia with all the countries which have now any carbon regulation in the form of carbon price, it is the data from World Bank reports, the states in terms of global carbon pricing. So there are about 60 countries or regions which have now carbon pricing in any forms. Among all these countries, Russia may be compared only with Kazakhstan in terms of the dependence on fossil fuels. And Kazakhstan has carbon price, but it is very low, and Kazakhstan does not differ a lot from Russia in terms of climate policies and its activity, actually. So Russia is really fossil fuel dependent country. For such a country, introduction of any climate policies is much more complicated than for countries which import fossil fuels, like the countries of the European Union. The next slide. But actually, the European Green Deal is, or may be, of course, one of the factors which may push Russia towards the more active climate policies. First of all, because of the reduction of demand for Russian fossil fuels. Here are some estimates of Russian exports of coal and gas to the European Union in different scenarios of European climate policies. There are 3 scenarios here: business as usual, so without any additional measures. INDC, it's INDC because this paper was written a couple of years ago, so it suggests the reduction of emissions in the European Union by 40% by 2030, but not by 55% by 2030, as is suggested nowadays. So it's probably a little bit underestimation here in terms of INDC scenario. And the green line shows the 2-degree scenario, which is more or less corresponding to the targets of the European Green Deal carbon neutrality by 2030. You may see that for Russian coal, bad times appear in Europe even in INDC scenario. So even without the full realization of the European Green Deal, there is no room for Russian coal in Europe anymore. For gas, the situation is better, and I do not see any signs of reduction of consumption of Russian gas in Europe until 2030. But after 2030, of course, if the European Green Deal would be realized to the full extent, the Russian gas would also lose the European market for sure. And the next slide. The other important issue, which is quite more urgent even than the reduction of demand for Russian fossil fuels, it is the CBAM, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, which is planned to be introduced in the European Union starting from 2022 or 2023. For Russia, it is quite sensitive because Russian exports is most carbon-intensive exports among all the leading economies. Here is a figure which compares Russian carbon intensity of Russian exports with carbon intensity of exports of all the other leading economies. The next slide. And there are different estimates of losses of Russian companies due to CBAM. They differ a lot, and it is clear that just because the exact framework of CBAM is not determined yet, and the details are not clear, and the sectoral coverage, the geographical coverage are not clear. So of course the estimates differ a lot, but estimates that are made in Russia, they are quite high. And the losses of Russian companies are estimated even in some scenarios at the level of 50 billion euro per year by 2030. I think that it is unrealistic. Frankly speaking, I think that most of these estimates are likely to overestimate the damage because for many factors, many methodological reasons, I think that the real losses of Russian companies would be much less. And I support the next slide, please. Rather the estimates of the European experts, which show that depending on scenario, the losses of Russian companies would vary from like 80 million euro per year to about 1 billion euro per year. Again, it depends on the concrete framework, how the CBAM would be implemented. But still, even these numbers are quite high, not as high as many Russian experts think, but even €500 million or 1 billion euro per year, it is a huge value actually, and it is a huge losses. So it is significant for Russian business, and it is significant for Russian economy. And Russian business is worried about the prospects of the CBAM. Many Russian companies already start negotiations themselves with European regulators and starting to introduce some carbon emissions reduction measures as well. And so for the last year, the dialogue about climate issues among business was much more active than such dialogue for the last decade. And I may see it just with my own eyes that any Russian company now discusses the climate issues and starts to find the solutions for them. So, and it is a good sign. Next slide. At the same time, I want to underline that Russian EU relations in the context of decarbonization and in the context of the European Green Deal, in the context of climate change mitigation. They should be examined, they should be discussed in a little bit broader context. Russia does not exist in vacuum, and the European Union doesn't exist in vacuum. They are interconnected with each other, and this interconnection also is reflected in the dynamics of emissions and in the volumes of emissions in each other. This table is a very good illustration of this. It demonstrates the fault line between the OECD countries, to which the European countries belong to, and BRICS countries, where Russia plays one of the central roles. The difference between these two groups of countries are it consists in the difference in the trends of energy of carbon exports and carbon imports, carbon embodied in international trade. So the European countries are huge importers of emissions embodied in trade. Look at Sweden, for example. Sweden is considered as low carbon economy, and it is low carbon economy. But at the same time, Sweden imports a lot of carbon intensive goods. And carbon footprint of Sweden per person is higher than carbon footprint of Russia per person. But these emissions are not generated in the territory of Sweden, they are generated in the territory of other countries, including of Russia. So Russia delivers carbon-intensive goods for the European Union. It is one of the reasons why Russian emissions are so high. The same situation is with China, India, South Africa, and so on. Of course, part of these emissions are associated with technological backwardness, with lack of climate policies, and so on. But part of these emissions is the reflection of specialization of the country on production of carbon-intensive goods like metals, fertilizers, chemicals, and so on and so forth. And this should be taken into consideration. The European Union can't be carbon neutral itself without the reduction of emissions in other countries. Or in the other case, it would be very, very one-sided carbon neutrality. So carbon neutrality just on the one territory without emission reduction in the other territories. The European Union should pay attention also on emissions embodied in its consumption. And these emissions embodied in its consumptions are associated with emissions in Russia to the huge extent. The next slide, please. And the other issue which should be taken into consideration in the context of the European Green Deal and Russia-EU relations within the framework of the European Green Deal is that it is much cheaper to reduce emissions in Russia than in the European Union. And it opens the huge window of opportunities. Because from the economic perspective, from purely economic perspective, let alone politics, let alone geopolitics and so on, from the purely economic perspective, it is more rational to reduce emissions in Russia than in the European Union. It is irrational to concentrate huge financial resources on the carbon neutrality and the territory which ensures 9% of global emissions, without taking anything, without taking any measures on the other parts of the world, which is responsible for 91% of global emissions. And Russia is one of the parts of this 91% of global emissions. So I think that it opens the window of opportunities, given that Russian economy and the European economy are interconnected through the flows of carbon-intensive goods. And given that emissions reduction in Russia is cheaper than emissions reduction in the European Union, it opens the opportunities for different offsets. It opens an opportunity for joint low carbon projects in the Russian territory, which again is cheaper than the low carbon projects in the European territory and are as important for climate as the efforts to reduce emissions in the European Union. I think that this movement towards cooperation in this area should be more intense, and again, economic opportunities for that are immense. Please, the next slide. Yeah, and unfortunately, the political contexts nowadays is not very favorable for these opportunities, of course. And we know that even the energy dialogue, including environmental dialogue between the European Union and Russia, stopped in 2014 after the Ukrainian crisis and all these events. And now nearly no dialogue exists between Russia and the European institutions. That's why, unfortunately, all these opportunities for cooperation, which are very economically very, very wide, they politically are not quite feasible. But what I want to say in the conclusion is that we may remember 1970, when the political context was not much better than today. And the relations between the European countries, including West Germany and Russia, were not much better than today again. But in 1970, it was not the obstacle for the deal which was called the deal of the century. The deal which suggested the provision of European technologies in order to ensure Russian exports of gas to Europe, to Germany first of all. And this deal of the century became the cornerstone to the EU-Russian cooperation and to EU-Russian interconnectedness for the next decades. And even now, so our gas interconnection is the heritage of that deal. And I think that we need the new European-Russian deal, the European-Russian Green Deal, probably, which will substitute that kind of interconnectedness, gas interconnectedness, which is not relevant to the our roads of today's, the green roads, and substituting it for other type of interconnectedness, greener interconnectedness based on the flows of green finance from the EU to Russia, and based on the different joint low carbon projects in renewables, in hydrogen, in many other areas which open the wide opportunities for cooperation. But of course, both Russia and the European Union should change the approaches to cooperation with each other, and including the cooperation in green area. Russia should start to look at it as an opportunity, and the European Union should start to look at Russia as an opportunity as well. Russia is not just the problem, it is part of solution. And it is very important to understand it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Igor, for this excellent presentation. And we now have about 20 minutes for Q&A, and we have quite a few questions in the chat already. Let me thank the participants for being so active. So I will try to cluster them. Let me start with, there were several questions concerning what Russia can do, what kind of, what types of energy, greener energy it can develop. So if you could comment on this, and I would like to flag a few issues. Nuclear energy. If I remember correctly, Russia has had a plan since the mid-2000s to increase nuclear energy production. And this was initially also not specifically aimed at reducing emissions, but at freeing gas that was used domestically for export abroad. So also for economic reasons. However, so I was wondering whether this can now be developed in a way that a greater role for nuclear. Now we're not talking about the risks related to it. There would be a lot to say, but I was wondering whether this can play a bigger role in Russia's decarbonization strategy. And also, as part of this, some other sources or carriers actually were mentioned. Green hydrogen, so hydrogen produced from renewables, and also a combination of blue hydrogen and carbon capture and storage. How do you see the prospects for these sources and technologies in Russia. Yeah, I don't know who would like to start with this one. Do you have any thoughts? Maybe Anna, please.
Thank you. All these are good questions. There are many opportunities for Russia to develop greener energy, low carbon energy, but this would require climate policy, because if there's no incentive, there's no economic incentive to do this, then why would anybody invest in it? They would have to be, I think, in many cases, there has to be quite a lot of Russian participation there. Can't just think that foreigners go and invest in something. You have to have the policy framework going, incentives in any case. So I think that's the kind of more the question than whether they could. Sure, they could, if they would. I think on nuclear, yeah, they would have that kind of technology available, and I would think there's also some interest there. Rosatom has been involved in renewable energy technology more recently, so there is something happening there. But I must say that things like hydrogen and carbon capture and storage, they're going to be pretty expensive. So I don't know if those are going to be the first option. Maybe Igor has something to add to that.
Yes, thank you. Actually, about nuclear energy, yes, Russia looks at it as one of the central parts of its decarbonization strategy, and believes that nuclear energy should be recognized as green energy in terms of climate change mitigation. Moreover, Russia is willing and really wants to produce hydrogen based on the nuclear energy. And it is at this level of the development of technologies, it is more feasible for now than to produce hydrogen based on renewables, based on the new renewables in Russia, based on solar, wind, and so on. The problem is that nuclear energy is not recognized by many European countries as green, and the hydrogen which is produced based on nuclear energy is also is not recognized as green hydrogen either. So this is an obstacle for the cooperation in this area between the EU and Russia, of course, and Russia would not recognize, would not produce any hydrogen based on nuclear energy for domestic markets. It would do it just for exports. But if there is no exports to the European Union and most of the nuclear power plants are located in the European part of Russia, so there would be no hydrogen based on the nuclear energy. So this is a problem. As for CCS, yes, I agree with Anna that there are no incentives now. In principle, it is possible, and the Russian oil companies say that they are ready to implement CCS technologies if the economic incentives for them appear. So technologically, technically it is possible in Russia, but it makes economic sense only if carbon price appears in the market, in the regulation. Without carbon price, it is absolutely senseless. The same is with gas. Again, hydrogen may be produced based on gas associated with CCS, and in this case, it would be carbon neutral or nearly carbon neutral. But again, it requires some synchronization of approach with the European Union, because the European Union wants green hydrogen, first of all. Without the demand from the European Union, Russia would not produce any hydrogen, at least in the European part of the country.
Thank you, both of you. I will move on to some other questions. So there were a couple of points about border carbon adjustment. So essentially this border tax that the EU is devising, and that should be introduced at some point in the early to mid 2020s. There was a question asking whether Russia should introduce domestic carbon pricing, whether this would be a logical response, I guess, to collect the money in Russia rather than let others collect it. And let me also add to this question. So on the one hand, we have this source of tension in a way, which stems from the introduction of the mechanism. But at the same time, do you see prospects for cooperation between European and Russian companies in the green fields? I know, for example, that something is happening, that Italian company Enel is investing in wind projects in several Russian regions from Murmansk to Stavropol. How do you see prospects for this? And I don't know who would like to, maybe Igor, would you like to say something on this?
Yes, thank you for these questions. As for domestic carbon price as a response to the CBAM, on the one hand, yes, it is rational, but on the other hand, it's not as simple as it may seem on the first glance, because for companies, for Russian large business, it is more beneficial to pay to the European regulators this €1 billion maximum or €500 million than to have domestic carbon price, because domestic carbon price would be for the whole production, not just for exports. Exports is just a small part of the production of even the largest companies. And so for business, it is better to pay to Europeans. It is paradoxical, but that's true. And that's why the position of business to the carbon price inside the country is not less than it was before CBAM, because for them it is much more painful than the European border carbon tax. From the perspective of the government and from the perspective of the whole economy, of course, it would be better if the companies would pay to the Russian budget than to the some European budget, or whenever it will go, or wherever it would go according to the scheme of CBAM. But the position of business is very strong, and that's why I think that there will be no carbon price in Russia in the next until 2025 at least, or even later, just because of the strong position of business. And as for the cooperation between Russian and the European companies, yes, there is cooperation already in the renewable sector. Not only Enel, but Fortum, for example, Finnish company, invests in Russia in the renewable energy, and there are some other companies which provide equipment and which provide some technologies in the renewable sector in Russia. The problem is that renewable sector in Russia is very, very small. So this cooperation is important, and but it may be considered as just a very, very first step, because the share of renewables without large hydro power plants is much less than 1% of total power generation in Russia. So part of this generation is provided by with European technologies, with the participation of European companies. So the scale of this cooperation now is very, very small. Probably it will be larger in the future, but again, the mechanism of support of renewables and this mechanism makes renewable energy in Russia economically beneficial. So it is determined already, and it does not suggest the expansion of renewables in the share of renewables in Russia, significant expansion.
Okay, thank you. Anna, would you like to add something on this?
Just a couple of quick points. Completely agree with Igor about all that. Maybe just to say that this is indeed the discussion about the CBAM that is going on in Russia at the moment, and Igor was kind of like giving you the points on that one. But of course, the EU doesn't have the rule on the carbon border tax yet. It would make it much harder for the Russian government, for the experts to design a mechanism that, first of all, would link to it easier. And as Igor said, it would then apply to the economy. So what if you came up with the price now and then the EU would reject it, but you already have the price for your own industry? So would you end up shooting yourself in the foot? Maybe not completely over time, but politically it would be quite a failure. So I think that might be one issue. And about the renewable energy, yeah, at least under the renewable energy tendering scheme, I don't know how influential the domestic technologies requirement is for foreign companies, because they would kind of maybe not be on the so familiar territory when using the Russian technologies as required to a large extent. And there was also a question about joint implementation and the voluntary projects. So here, of course, one could think that some renewable energy projects would maybe be implemented together with foreigners in Russia under that kind of scheme. But of course, there the question is, how well is Russia going to perform on that kind of project bureaucratically? Is it going to be like joint implementation was, that it took for years to get it going, and then there were many revisions, and then we ran out of time? And perhaps the time aspect is not so important here, but I think these kind of thoughts are going to be there, at least in the European mind, to try to participate. And some countries, Denmark, I think, even dropped out because it wasn't going anywhere. Hopefully it's going to work better, and it's very good that Russia is already getting active on that now, defining the carbon unit on regulatory basis. So that is going to help, and hopefully it's going to encourage the investors over time. Thanks.
Thank you. There were two more questions. They were more clarifications. Someone was asking whether Russia is involving subnational entities in low carbon strategies. And then another question was about the clarification of how Russia adopted the Paris Agreement. So why did the Duma fail to ratify it? And it was the president that adopted the agreement. So before I come back to you, Anna and Igor, on these points, and maybe for any final remarks you might have, let me turn briefly to Jussi again to discuss a very relevant point that we somewhat neglected so far. We have been focusing more on perhaps technical issues, but I would also like to hear whether climate-related activism and concern in Russia is just a concern of civil society organizations, NGOs, or if, for example, the non-systemic opposition has something to say on this, as far as you know. For example, has Navalny said anything, just to cite a very widely discussed figure of the last months, on the topic of climate, or is he focusing simply on corruption and on other issues?
Okay, thanks. Well, I think the answer could be in two letters: no, unfortunately. And then Igor already mentioned, I think this is something, and I think this point in our briefing paper is something in a more speculative about taking to a stand at how the climate, I would say the climate consciousness emerged in the West. It started from the environmental issues. And I think what we witness now in Russia is that definitely the environmental issues has become a topic, but they are related more about this kind of a criticism and kind of a growing conflict between the civil society and the regime. So it's, for example, if you take a look at the environmental problems, there are quite a lot of different references. It's about voicing a certain local groups, and there's a lot of criticism and even this sort of a local nationalism issues, that this is our territory, don't bring your strange waste here and something like that. In that respect, the climate change is completely absent, but there are signs of that they might use for the reputation purposes, that if there is a kind of this growing consciousness globally on those issues, then it becomes a problem. That the point is that there is not that if the climate change is okay for voicing their local concerns, then it's okay. It's not such a thing that it would be automatically opposite. But so far it's becoming. But when it comes to this, the most debatable political issues in Russia, I think the climate change is still relatively absent. But definitely what we see in Moscow and St. Petersburg and some of metropoles, we see exactly those developments what were present in the West, let us say 10, 15 years ago, about the recycling, about the concerns and all kinds of issues. So I think it's a matter of time. And this, of course, related to the discussion on these structural developments, and this may increase the politicization in terms of this, while we have this sort of a very conflictual situation between the Russia and the EU, and then within Russia with Russia and this growing dissent among the civil society. So this is maybe, I would say, that potential horizon, but at the moment it's a more or less absent.
Thank you very much, Jussi. So I would now give the floor back to Anna and then Igor, if you can address the 2 points on subnational entities and ratification and any other thing that is important in 2 minutes.
Thanks. The issue of adopting the Paris Agreement, the Duma did not refuse to ratify, but it was bypassed. So it was more maybe a glimpse into a potential problem that would have been there, which was avoided. There was some discussion about this, why this was this way, because normally the Russian State Duma would follow the views of the president. But yes, then about, I don't know very much about the national entities, we're talking about the regions. But of course, many things like, for instance, the waste reform, it's completely implemented on the regional and even municipal level. There wouldn't be any chance on the federal level to pick and choose, for instance, like local waste collectors and so on. So there is a huge role there. Also in adaptation, I think Igor might correct me if I'm wrong, but I think also in the adaptation plan, there was some like further planning on how the regions would develop their own, some kind of plans or programs. So they tend to be there, but it depends really very much what we're talking about, how strong the role is. On the waste reform is very strong, but on something which maybe is less regional, it might be token. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. About the regional entities, there are 2 important issues, how they are involved in the terms of adaptation. Yes, the national adaptation plan, it requires that by 2022, all the regions should provide their adaptation plans. So regions start to work on that direction. And the other important issue is that Sakhalin region, Sakhalin Oblast, is the first region in Russia which will have the carbon regulation scheme first, and which sets the carbon neutrality targets already by 2025. So, and it is considered as some pilot regulation scheme, which probably, if it is successful, would be expanded to other regions and probably to the whole Russia. It is in the very, very beginning of its implementation, actually, and I would not overestimate the significance of this example, but however, it is a good first step, and so it is an example of how some regions, not all the regions, of course, but some of them, the most enthusiastic regions, are involved into this issue. As for the way how Russia not ratified but adopted Paris Agreement, I think that it is very, very no some strategic vision of that, no strategic reasons, but very tactical reason is that Russia should make the decision on the joining of Paris Agreement before COP in Poland, and that it should be done quickly. And to make it quicker, there was a decision to adopt it at the level of Prime Minister in the government, but not at the level of State Duma, just to make it quickly. I don't think that there could be any opposition in State Duma. There is no opposition in State Duma in Russia in any questions, including this one. That's why I think that it was just very tactical issue, bureaucratic issue, and nothing else. So don't overestimate the meaning of this issue. And finally, I saw a couple of more questions. I won't answer on all of them, but very quickly, I don't think that Russia may win from climate change, of course, and nobody in Russia nowadays believes in this. Fortunately, it was an issue about 10 years ago, but now in most of people think that Russia will suffer from climate change and forest fires and melting permafrost. They are already here, and nobody thinks that bananas will grow in Siberia anymore. And I think responding to the other question very quickly, that yes, in Russia it is cheaper to reduce emissions than in the European Union, and opportunities which open due to that is to link carbon regulation scheme in Russia with the carbon regulation scheme in the European Union. If they are linked, it means that European companies may invest to low carbon projects in Russia. It would be beneficial for Russia, of course. It would be beneficial for the European companies, because for them it would be cheaper to reduce emissions. Of course, for the European Union, it's some doubtful initiative, and I'm not sure that the European Union would agree on that, but at least Russia may propose, and it would be the argument in negotiations, and it would be the platform for further negotiations and for further some joint solutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Igor, also for addressing the questions that I wasn't able to pick up. And so we promised that this seminar would end at 1:15, and we are already a bit over time. But now I really need to close the seminar. I'm really happy that there was so much interest and participation. So let me thank the audience for being so active once again, and our speakers for excellent presentations. Thank you very much, and see you at the next FIA climate briefing. Have a good day.